Welcome to Continuous Quality with Postman. My name is Joyce. I'm the head of developer relations at Postman. I'm so pleased that you've registered and are ready to learn today. Neil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Neil Studd. I'm a senior developer in test at Postman. I joined Postman a few months ago, but I've been a Postman user for probably 5 or 6 years now. The last 2 or 3 companies that I worked for have all been in the API space, so I've known Postman to be a really valuable tool. And like a lot of people, I've known enough about it to do just what I need to do, but there's so much other stuff going on just outside the stuff that you know every day. That is what I'm going to try and show you today.
Yeah, so I've been with Postman for a while, so I really know the Postman side of things. Neil, you knew Postman, but you're a practitioner. You get paid to do testing, and so I think I'm really excited about what you're going to bring to this next hour. All right, so if you signed up for this session and you're like, I don't know what continuous quality is, we will go over what that means. Don't worry about it if you've never heard of it before. We'll talk about some recommended testing practices, as well as test automation, a few different ways to automate your tests to be a little bit more efficient. At the end, we'll cover some of the resources. We'll be introducing resources throughout the session, but then also at the end, we'll have a nice encapsulated list for you to take a look at. And then we will have a few minutes at the very end to ask Q&A, but remember to ask your questions throughout under the Q&A portion of chat. We do have some people waiting in the wings to answer your questions. So don't hesitate to ask your questions real time as you have them. All right, so before we get started, I have a question for all of you. Let's go ahead and pop that first poll. How long have you been using Postman? So we get a feel of who is in the room at the time. And then how much experience do you have with writing tests in Postman? So this will let us know where to focus a little bit more of our time on, and also just let us know who in general is signing up for these types of courses. All right, so we have a bunch of people answering. How long have you been using Postman? And how much experience do you have with writing tests in Postman? Let's go ahead and end the poll and see our results. Okay, so it's across the board. We have about a quarter, less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, and then 3+ years. So it's pretty evenly distributed. That's good to know. That doesn't really help Neil too much. How much experience do you have with writing tests in Postman? Okay, we have a standard distribution. It sounds like we have some people with no experience. Welcome to your first taste of Postman. Some people can write a basic test. If you took intro to testing, you should know how to write a basic test. And then a lot of people have triggered tests in the runner. That surprises me, more than 50%. And then 15% have run tests through Newman. You're in for a treat. And we do have 5% that knows so much that I could write a book. I wonder if that's a Postmanaut. Or Neil, did you answer?
It wasn't me.
Yeah. Okay, so that's good to know. One more question for you. Another poll should be on your screen. How much of your team's API testing is performed by non-testers? Ooh, Neil, this was your question. This is pretty provocative, huh? Go ahead and answer.
When we talk about continuous quality, yeah.
Well, continuous quality, it really is important to know if you have a dedicated test function or if everyone's responsible for it. I got reamed out once because in the early days, Postman didn't have a dedicated test function, and testers were mad about it. Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll. How much of your team's API testing is performed by non-testers? Interesting, we have another standard distribution. So 30% says none of the testing is performed by non-testers. Some of it, 50%, it's a little shared load. And then a good 20% said a lot of it or all of it is performed by non-testers. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, the good news for the 30% is I'm going to be showing you some stuff that allows people to be testing without even realizing they're testing. So you can trap them into doing testing for you.
Trick them into eating their vegetables, doing something that'll make them big and strong. Okay. So, a lot of people think about testing synonymously with Postman, and what they really mean is the bottom of this a model here, exploring an API. updating parameters, hitting send, inspecting what they get back. Really, that's what they mean by testing an API, learning more about an API. But if you went to Intro to Testing a few weeks ago, you know how to write a test. It's different. Exploring an API is different than actually writing a test because the test is repeatable. You also have a sneak peek at how to write test suites. And today we'll be focusing on ways to amplify how you write tests, as well as the automation and the integration part. Okay, so in today's session, we'll be covering what is continuous quality. We'll be extending and diving into some external libraries in the scripting area of Postman Sandbox. We'll talk about a few different ways to automate the Postman runner, monitors, and Newman. And this one I'm super excited about. If we have time at the end, we'll be doing snapshot testing using Postman's mocks. I've not seen that done before, so I'm really excited about that. And I will just give a call out. So originally I wanted to call this session continuous testing because we've done this session before. It was rather popular the last 2 years running. And that session was about the mechanics, how to do something in Postman continuously, right? But what is continuous quality? Neil insisted on calling it continuous quality. And so I Googled continuous quality is the systematic approach to finding and fixing software defects during all phases of the software development cycle. Is this correct, Neil? What's the difference between continuous quality and continuous testing?
Well, that definition is still quite close to continuous testing, actually, although it does acknowledge that you are both finding and fixing the defects. So the really important thing for me when we have discussions about quality or testing, for example, when we think about what testers' job title should we be testers or should we be QAs? When people talk about testing, they tend to be very much focused on the actual activity of testing, as per your last slide. And all that stuff is totally valid, but there's kind of this big bubble of other stuff around it. There's more to quality than just doing testing. You'll hear me name dropping this a lot throughout the session, but a lot of what we're trying to do is encouraging collaboration across disciplines. And we're trying to do that by surfacing information as testers. We're delivering information to teams to help them make decisions. And those activities aren't really testing as such, but they're also massively important, particularly, again, as per your definition here, Joyce, the earlier you're doing these things, the easier it is to stop problems from creeping into your software in the first place. So we're going to look a lot about test design as well, because part of that test design is, again, communicating with the other disciplines in your team and understanding what it means to have quality software. What are we trying to test in the first place? Why are we doing it this way? And as testers, it's really vital that we're part of this quality discussion.
So this is more about the mindset throughout the entire organization and how the organization handles quality versus like the mechanics of testing, like literal tactics of testing.
Yeah. There are other big buzzwords, things like shift left, and this kind of falls in the same thing. I think shift left has become a bit of a dirty term. People don't like it. It's kind of a buzzword bingo thing. So I'm trying to coin continuous quality because it's less well known.
I was thinking it sounds similar to shift left. It sounds similar to the principles of agile software development, just being able to find defects earlier in the cycle. Okay, so well, that gives us a little sneak peek. So are we ready to get to the hands-on part?
Let's do it.
Okay, so Neil is going to be sharing his screen. If you want to follow along at home, and I urge you to, this program was designed for you to be tactical about it. Neil will show you how to get started, but the link, we'll go ahead and drop this in the chat. This is a link to our Postman Space Camp public workspaces, where you can find all the course materials, including a collection called Continuous Quality with Postman. So go ahead whenever you're ready, Neil.
I will take control now. And I will I'm here in my completely empty team workspace, a brand new team that I created for the session. I'll show you another way of finding it. There's this great big search bar at the top of Postman, which will search absolutely everything that's been made public across the infrastructure. So if I type Space Camp into the search bar, that even though I personally have no association with the session as my team, because the Postman Space Camp workspace is public, there it is as the first search result in the list. And if I click on this, I will be shifted over to the workspace. So here is our project we're going to work on today, Continuous Quality with Postman. That's our collection. You'll see further down, as name checked earlier, Postman and Introduction for Testers is there, which is the previous session. We're going to look at continuous quality. Now, if I click on this, it will open up the documentation in a sidebar. And the easiest way to get this into your own personal workspace is to use this great glowing Run in Postman button. Now, if I click this, it will ask whether I want to fork the collection. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with things like forks or pull requests, which are very common parlance in source control, basically it's like taking a copy of this project into your own space, but it also maintains a link to the original one. So this means that if we were to make changes to the original collection, you could then pull those into your own one. Or if you found a problem within our collection, you could then push those changes back into the original one. So it keeps the relationship between the two projects. I will click the fork collection button. I'll click it better than that. Not familiar with this big mouse pointer I've got for this session. So here it's telling us that basically what I already said, that you're going to maintain a relationship to this original collection. You can give a name to your fork just to give it a name that you can identify. I'm going to just call it Niels. And you choose where you want to put it. In my team, I have a team workspace, which is shared with everyone on my team, or I have my own personal workspace. For today, I'm just going to put it in my personal one. I'm not ready for anyone to see this yet, but having chosen this, I can click Fork Collection. And I should be brought back into my team. And now I'm in my workspace with the continuous quality collection there. Now, again, the documentation is here on the right. I'm not going to walk through the documentation today, but the really good thing is if I've skipped over things or I'm going too fast or if there's things I haven't got time for, every single subfolder in here, we've got 5 chapters we're going to try and work through, which corresponds to what Joyce showed you that we're going to learn today. Each one of these has its own documentation tab that goes into a lot of detail. There's a lot of external links to help you go through it in your own time. So I'm going to put the documentation out of the way for now, but really note that it's there because it should help you along the way if you're coming back to this later. And we'll start with the first topic I want to talk about, which is how you actually write a test in Postman and what even is a test. So in fact, when we think about what a test is, think about it in terms of general automation. When you write an automated test, a lot of people refer to these now as what we call automated checks, because a test is only doing a binary verification of something you've asked it to check. So it will do what we call an assertion. It was, you say, I expect to find the value X, and then we see what the value we find. If it's X, then the test passes. If it's not X, the test fails. So tests are only as automated tests are only as intelligent as the information that you ask it to check. If you ask it to check 100 things and those things are all green, if there's a 101st thing that's really important that's stopping your site from working or your endpoint from returning what you expect, your tests are giving you a false sense of security. So we're going to look at a few of the ways in which you can use Postman scripting to really get really in depth into the data that's coming back and to check whether it is valid or not. And the first one I'm going to use for that is a library called Chai. And in doing so, let me slide the sidebar out of the way, give yourself some more room to work with. I'll introduce you to the application that we're going to be testing mostly today. And it's an application called the Unbreakable API. If I just click send to send this request, you'll get a feel for what the API is going to bring back. And as you will see, it is data about movies. It's basically, it's an application that was built in-house to be representative of a real world application. So we have a movie database in here. It's meant to represent like a video rental store. So we also have the concept of customers, and they can perform rentals and they can return those rentals. We're just going to use it. Basically, it doesn't matter what we're using today. The thing we care about is the test that we're writing against this. So this is the application we've chosen to test today. I'm going to move the example response out of the way for now and just go across to the tests that I've written to show you what we do in Chai. So the tests tab here in Postman, this one here is the test for this particular request. Now we have test tabs in several different places. If I go back to the collection for a second, you will notice that if I go up to the name of this folder, the power of libraries, we have a tests tab here as well. And in fact, I've put a test in here, which as the comment says, this one here, because tests trickle down, this one will run against every test in the folder, every request in the folder. So I already have 4 requests, and this test will run against all of those. So effectively, that's giving me extra test coverage by putting it into one place. And even higher than that, you can also do them at the collection level as well. I haven't done any in this case. And there is documentation that tells you about the execution order of what runs first. But the main place you'll write them is within an individual request. I'm going to show you a couple of very basic ones to begin with, just to orient yourself. I know we have 25% of people who haven't written a test before, so this will be new to some people. So let's just go through this slowly. So we got a response back from our endpoint, and you saw that response down here. We asked it for movie ID 964, and it turns out that movie corresponds to the film called The Beach, which was a Leonardo DiCaprio film from the year 2000. Now we want to start, if we want to start working with this data and verifying against it, we want to ask Postman to let us work with the response. Now, if you're completely new and you're not sure how to do that, we have a sidebar here that contains what we call snippets. And snippets are your savior. In fact, I still use snippets every day. There's really basic guides to how to do really basic things. I will throw in, for example, that, you know, that test I had in that folder that checked we got a 200 OK response. Not to show you, not to demean my work, but if I click this button, there's that test. It really wasn't complicated. Now you've got a test that checks you get the correct response code back. And if you do one, for example, that says, I want to check the response contains a string. Sorry, not string. I want to do a JSON value check because it's a JSON response. You'll see here, but as I've reused below, the key thing to do is you use the PM, which is the Postman sandbox. You do pm.response.json, and that will give you control of the JSON that came back from that response. Now, in my example, I've had to put one tiny extra thing in, and this is a good example of what software is like in the real world. This response brings back only one movie, but it does so in a way, if you're familiar with JSON structure, this is actually a list. It's a list of effectively one item, but there's nothing to say you couldn't then have a comma at the end of this and then another one after it. So it's slightly strange design, I think deliberately. But this is an example of why you would want to have quality conversations, because the first thing you would do is go back to your development team and say, well, why have we done that? It's making the tests slightly harder to write. It's slightly misleading. You know, the user has asked for one thing and you've given them a list of one thing. Do we really want to do that? The only thing that it's causing us a problem in the first place here is we have to put this just a bracket, a 0 in square brackets to say we want to get the first item that came back, even though there's always one item. We just have to do it on this particular endpoint to get the film back. And we're putting it into a variable called film data so that we can completely forget about the fact that we're dealing with this list. From now on, we're just going to work with the variable called film data. And I'm going to show you two tests, which are basic, straightforward syntax of Chai. For example, if we want to check that the film title that's come back is The Beach, we can say we expect the film data.title to equal The Beach. So this is Chai syntax here, and there's a link to the documentation of understanding what Chai is, but Chai is like a TDD and BDD style language that helps to create basically sentence structure tests. So you can read that even as a non-tester and get a grasp of what it's trying to do. If, for example, I was to change The Beach to say Titanic, we want that other big Leonardo DiCaprio film, and now I send this, then that test will fail. We've got 8 out of 9 tests passing. This one here has failed because it expected The Beach, which is the data we got back, to actually be Titanic. Now, there's nothing to say you can't check more than one thing in a test. So here I've got a test here that checks multiple attributes in one go. So we're checking the year and the minutes that come back. And yeah, that's as far as a lot of people go with Postman. That covers a lot of people's options. You know, you're sending off a particular payload, you're getting another payload back, and you're checking that the data within it is what you expect. But what we really want to do is really broaden the types of checks that we do. Because, for example, if we were to change this ID to be some other film, if we now go and get film 999, we're going to get failures because we were expecting The Beach, because we hard-coded our test to expect The Beach. What we would really like is some more generalized tests that will work against whatever response comes back to confirm that whatever response comes back is correct. So to do that, I'll just show you a few of these where I don't want to get too bogged down in Chai, but as an example, we can do just a data type check. So rather than checking the exact year that comes back, this line I've highlighted here will check that film data.year, we expect it to be a number. So if we get a film back that's from the year 1999, this test will pass as long as the 1999 is a number and it's not a string or it's not an exact date. So this is a test that we could run against any ID that we send. Similarly, this is an example of a test that helps to ensure continuous quality. So remember that issue where we had to put the square bracket 0 because we could potentially get a list back? Our developer has maybe said, oh, don't worry, you'll never get more than one back. This is kind of a risk mitigation test, because what I'm doing is I'm saying I expect the JSON length that comes back, i.e. the number of items, to equal 1. So if they ever break their promise and start sending a second one back, we'll get a failure. We also got a really good type of test to write is a schema test that checks basically the attributes that come back and their values. So if I show you again this example down here, you see the response we get back when we ask for a film. It contains actors, it contains categories, it contains directors, it contains genres. We can ask using Chai, because so we expect the film data to have all of these keys. So the keys are the names for these bits on the left, the attributes that come back. And we say we expect it to have all of these. So again, if I suddenly started to expect to have something else coming back, producer, for example, if I send this, that test will fail because it expected it to have all the keys. It did not contain producer, so it failed. You can also get into much more thorough schema checks, and this is the type of test that will give you real value in the long term. It's a little bit longer and more long-winded to put together, but there's an example here, and there's a link to the AJV documentation. AJV is, I think it stands for Advanced JSON Validation. This is a JSON schema represented here. So you see, again, we have a property called actors, and we expect it to be of type string. And again, we've sat down here and we've defined what we expect our response to be. We've identified oddities along the way. So the rating that comes back, for example, will occasionally come back as null. So in order for this test to pass, we've had to set nullable as true. And again, as testers, we can then go back to the development team and say, well, why is the rating sometimes null? Because this could potentially cause you problems downstream. If your API's consumers, they don't know about this, they may be implementing something that doesn't expect nulls to come back. So it's really useful to have conversations with the development team about the data that you're finding. You can also touch upon things, again, to look at in your own time. You can get to data in the response headers. So you could check, for example, what the content type is that comes back, or you could check the response time that it took to come back. And as you'll see in future tests that we go through, you can also set variables that you can then reuse later downstream. So you can pick data out of that response and move it on further down the line.
For that schema validation example, the one on row like 30 something.
Yeah.
Do you need to define your schema right there?
No, not necessarily. I mean, this is a particularly simple schema. If your schema had many nested objects, and this was hundreds and hundreds of lines of JSON, I mentioned variables. One of the things you could do is actually physically move this data into a variable, either a collection variable or environment variable. And then you could say, actually, go and get the variable. So rather than having schema equals a big long line of tests, you could say, I put it into a variable called my schema, and that becomes much more readable.
I think Mayank asked that question. So let us know if you have any follow-up questions, and continue to ask your questions in the Q&A. I think that's really fascinating. I think, Neil, you've demonstrated that you've basically written JavaScript in Chai without actually writing anything, just by inserting snippets. But I think the value in this collection is just seeing the examples of what's possible. Because as somebody that doesn't write tests every day, just seeing somebody else's, I know I can modify your code to make my scenario tested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much documentation in this area as well. I shan't jump out to it now, but if you were to click something like learn more about test scripts, you go straight into our learning center, where there is so much in-depth detail, and there's much more than I could possibly cover today. I'm going to literally name check 2 other libraries. So we've covered the Postman sandbox and the Chai syntax that is common to most tests. Just a couple of things that you may not have heard of before that can really help to simplify the code that you write, particularly if you're someone who's not experienced with code. One of the things we deal with a lot as testers and when writing code is dates, either getting date timestamps or comparing whether a date is before another date. There is a library that you can use that's bundled with Postman called Moment. And we're going to use the Postman echo endpoint for this, which is just, as you're going to see here, I'm going to send a payload that's got 3 variables built into it. We'll look at those variables in a second, but you'll see as soon as I send this and it echoes those variables back to me, I have a variable called today, and it has worked out in British format what today's date is. It's worked out what tomorrow's date is, and it's worked out what the last of the month is. I'm going to go across now and show you the code that's been used for that, and you'll be amazed how little code we needed in order to actually determine those dynamic variables. Obviously, if I ran this yesterday, for example, then today would have been a different date, but this has been generated dynamically on the fly with very little code. This has been done, this time we're going into the pre-request script. So the pre-request tab gets run before the request is sent. So you can do a lot of preparation before the request goes out, particularly if, in my case, you want to actually input some value into these variables. So in the pre-request script, I've got a link there again to the documentation for Moment.js for you to have a look at in your own time. All we have to do is we say, well, actually, we want to use the Moment library and use a require statement to do that. So you say const moment equals require moment. And now if I want to get today's date, as you saw in the body there, all I need to do is say, well, today is moment. That will get you the current date and time. If you want to know tomorrow, it's as simple as doing moment.add one day. And so you can imagine if you wanted to get the date 3 weeks ago or 27 months from now, You could do that with one line of code and it would be instantly readable. All of this is stuff that's possible in native JavaScript, but you'd have to write whole entire functions, particularly for things like this one here. I love the helpers that are in Moment. You can just ask it, what is the end of the month that we're in now? The number of times I've had to write JavaScript functions that say the classic thing of, well, if the current month is September or April or June or November, then it's 30 days. If it's February, then we need to check if we're in a leap year before we know how many days we've got. In Moment, you could do it with one line, one command, and you're just done. And as you can see from the commands below where we set the variables, it also has the option to format it. So we can work out exactly what format we want to put out. For example, it is a full date timestamp here. So if I was to put hours and minutes here and resend this and look at the response that comes back, you will see that I'm in the UK. So that is accurate as my current time. Oh, it's also telling me we're running a bit over. I will try and speed along a bit, but there you go. There's so much stuff in Moment. It's a really, really powerful toolbox. There's some examples in the test as well, where you can see you can compare dates to work out whether dates are before or after other dates, calculate the time between dates. Moment, if you've not found it, is a really useful library, Joyce.
Yeah, I mean, don't calculate date time yourself. Somebody else has already solved that. I do believe they're deprecating Moment, but probably not for a while. And it's just so helpful. Lots of formatting and just calculations.
Yeah, they're aiming to get it pushed into native JavaScript so that these commands are more easily available on the fly. But the important thing is they are available to you.
Yeah.
The other big one is a library called Faker. Now, there's a huge long list of variables that you can use here to basically generate dynamic data on the fly. Now, one of the big things that we're all guilty of as testers is using the same data in our tests over and over again. You know, if you see an email attribute, then you just put test@test.com. Now, the danger of doing that is something that's known as the pesticide paradox, which is if you use the same data over and over again, then your tests are going to become resilient to it. Let's imagine that test@test.com does one time find a bug. Then your developer is going to fix that bug. They're probably going to write a unit test to make sure that particular bug never happens again, at which point using test@test.com is pointless because it's never going to find a bug. So by generating dynamic data and adding diversity into your data sets, you can find interesting things on the fly. And you'll see if I start to use this dollar syntax, if I start typing, I want a random, there are so many of these different things you can get, a random bank account name, a random image, a random picture of a cat. Everyone needs random pictures of cats. So if I send this here, you'll see on my first send, I get Dr. Archie Dietrich. If I press send again, I'm going to get different random data. So I get Teresa Botsford this time. And again, that helps you tease things out of your systems. Like if there are weird length restrictions, you know, if you send a particularly short or a particularly long value, every time you send a request using this one, it will send different data. So this is really valuable for exploratory testing. And basically, every time you press send, you're generating a new scenario. And you can also, there's an example here that I won't go through now, but in the pre-request, I show an example of actually, you'll see is admin user, doesn't have that dollar symbol in front. And that's because this is a real Postman variable, but I'm setting in the pre-request script, and then I'm tracing it through to the tests so that I can perform checks on the data that we sent through. So this is something people ask a lot of the time is, well, if I'm generating random values, how do I know what I'm asserting for in the tests? And the answer is you can track it through, set it in the pre-request, make a note of what the data was that you set, and then you can chase it down and say, check the data actually came back, was that. My life before Faker seems almost meaningless now.
I love Faker, and I love the emoji that you selected for that too. Bravo.
And I'm very, very briefly going to touch upon Postman's visualizer, mostly because this is something that a lot of people are aware of, but aren't aware of the things that it can do for testers. Just trying to move a bar out of my way. I'm just going to quickly go across to the Postman documentation for the visualizer, so that it's the easiest way to show you what it does. The most common thing that people use it for is to generate data visualizations. So for example, pie charts, line graphs, heat maps, all sorts of things like that, where basically it takes a set of data and then outputs it in a particular way. But we can really harness this as testers, and I have found this really valuable in my time as a tester. That's the wrong window. There's the correct window. That's the project we're working with. If I click on Visualizer, let me show you the problem. If I hit send on this endpoint here, this is every movie in our collection. And I won't scroll down it, but there are 50,000 lines of JSON here. Now, if you imagine someone had asked you, well, how many of our movies are currently out of stock? There's a property in there that says stock 0. How am I going to find all of them? Well, I could do a command F or a control F. I could search. It looks like there are 500 of them. I could walk through them. I have to do a lot of scrolling around. That's a real pain. If I flip over to what I've done with the visualizer, I have iterated over that list of films, and I've done some clever conditional stuff to automatically highlight the ones that are out of stock. There are duplicates in here because it's a test database, but you'll see I can now just eyeball this and see much quicker exactly what's going on. So this is really valuable if, for example, I worked on an application where it generated like this, 50,000 lines of JSON. I only cared about 2 or 3 pieces of information. So rather than having to manually scroll through the JSON when I'm exploratory testing, I can use the visualizers to say, just pull out the information that matters to me. And again, I can use things like conditional logic and say, hide records that aren't particularly interested to me. Maybe I only want to see people who've used test at test.com. I could use a filter in here. It's set up in the test tab. Again, I would recommend walking through that visualizer documentation. But what you've got is basically a template. You'll recognize there, I've got a title that says this is the Postman user library. And without getting too deep into the syntax here, which is a language known as handlebars, you'll see there's a loop that gets iterated through here. It says for every single field we've got, we're going to do a thing. And there's an if loop in there, an if clause in there as well. It's one to look at in your own time. There's a couple of exercises for the reader down there that says, actually, maybe you could filter that list to just show you all the ones that are out of stock. It's quite easy. So
I love
that's
it.
the way that you can use the visualizer in a way that we basically don't advertise that.
Yeah, JSON's not hard to read, but it's unwieldy, especially if you have a large data set. Can you imagine trying to understand lat longs? What if you had a list of lat longs and you're like, oh yes, I picture it in my map. Nobody thinks like that, so you can just visualize it.
I have a really good personal example I need to blog about that I've just put together because I've just got a Peloton bike recently, and Peloton give you a data dump of every ride you've ever done. But if you want to work out what your PBs are, you either need to sit there and do some manual
Personal
sorting of
best
data. Yes.
Okay.
So basically, yeah, I can use a visualizer and say, actually, just output the highest number and then stop. It's really, really useful. But I want to jump over now and start talking about that's how you write an individual test. But we want to get more into the subject of automation and how you start to chain these together. And I'm going to show you a couple of scenarios of using the runner for those who haven't used it before, including, so I'm going to show you basically one simple one and one slightly more advanced one. The runner, if you're not familiar with it, is also known as the collection runner. It is a way of chaining a whole load of requests one after the other, particularly if there's relationships between those requests, to basically perform a workflow test and say, start with request 1, do that, then do something else after it, then do something else after it. If I start by showing you this first folder, which I've called simple linear sequence, this is kind of representative of a lot of the way that we use it, certainly internally at Postman. We have a lot of tests that I've written to use the runner. If I expand these folders within the simple linear sequence, you will see the workflow here. So I first of all, I start by creating a user in the Unbreakable API database. Then I create a customer. I make sure I can get the customer back. I create a new movie. I check and get that customer back. So this is kind of basically a happy path end-to-end workflow of one example of a path through the system. Now, if I wanted to test all of that, I could open each of these requests individually. I could hit the send button. I could look in the test tab, and I could get a lot of that. But that's a lot of manual clicking. So this is where the runner comes in. If I click on the name of the folder, then a run button is up here. There are other ways to get to it too. There's always a runner button in the bottom right. But if I click run within a particular context, then Postman knows what it is that I'm trying to run, and it will be clever about it. And you'll see it's populated all of the requests from simple linear sequence into here. And in fact, it even gives me some configuration options here, such as, well, if I'm not happy with running this once, if I want to be really sure things are going okay, I'm going to run it 5 times. And it will do it as a breeze. I could choose to put delays in there, all sorts of things there. I'm going to hit run, and the runner will appear. I'm going to show you the summary view. And there you'll see it's currently going through the 2nd iteration. Now it's going through the 3rd iteration. We've got green across the board. The 4th time through is all good as well. There we go. We've been through all those requests 5 times. We've asserted every single test in every single one of those. I didn't step into all those in turn because of time, but there are tests in each of those. All of those tests have passed. So 5 run-throughs of that particular scenario have returned no problems. So assuming my test coverage is good enough, that's giving me pretty good confidence of what's going on there. So that's one ad hoc run of using the runner in a simple fashion.
That's so satisfying. And we have a question from Hitesh about very similarly running a sequence for CRUD operations, but they don't want to create a new request. How can you do this? Is it possible? I think you're about to get to that, Neil.
It sounds like we could do it as a variation of this second one. So this second one, which I've called nonlinear execution. This is basically one of the most common things that I see requested on the forums. This particular scenario, this is someone who said, for example, Suppose I have made one request and I've got like 10 IDs back, and now I want to do a GET request for each of those 10 IDs. How can I do that without duplicating code or to optimize my code base, so I don't have to rewrite 10 different things? So we can use a function called setNextRequest within the test, but we're going to get to it. I'm going to walk through this particular scenario. I'll run it manually first so you can understand what's going on. We're going to start again with our list of all the movies. And I'm not going to work on all the movies because, like I said, there's 50,000 lines of code here. So actually in the tests tab, one thing I've done here using another great library that we've not got time to talk about today called Lodash. Basically, I've got the complete response JSON back as we showed you in the very first test. And then using Lodash, I said, well, filter that, take this load of data in the JSON data and give me just the data that is from the year 1999 with a 4-star rating, just so that we're working with, I think this is 18 films that come back from this. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that data into a variable. I'm putting it into a global variable that I've called film list. And if I expand the variables a panel to get a quick look at it, there you can see there is some film data in there. I could go deeper and edit it, but data is now stored for a variable called film list, which is all the data that I want to work with in these upcoming tests. Now, the second one, which is called check IMDb link. Let me explain what this is going to do, and then we'll walk through how it does it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get one of the films out that list. I am going to work out what its IMDb link is, because that's part of the data that comes back is what is the imdb.com URL for this film. We're going to go to that link, as you can see here. And then we're going to verify that the film that comes back is the film that we expect, because we know the film that we expect to find, and we're going to check that IMDb is showing the correct film. And then we're going to use some Postman magic to go and do a loop to do that over and over and over again until we've exhausted all the films. So if we start in the pre-request, so the first thing we need to do is we need to get back that global variable that I just talked about called film list, and we're going to put it into a variable called remaining films to check. Now, let me explain what I then go on and do here. We use a JavaScript option called pop. Now, if you're not familiar with pop, think of popping as being like a bunch of grapes or a bunch of anything. If you pop one off the end of it, you've now got two things. You've got the one you just got, which in my case there on line 4, we're putting into a variable called this film. So this is the thing we care about right now. But we've also changed the original thing because the remaining films to check now has one fewer films in it. It had 18 before, it's now got 17. And once we've popped this one off, we work out what its IMDb URL is. We work out what the title of the film is. We put these into variables that we're now going to use. And the final important bit is we update that global variable again. We update the film list with the new list. So we popped that one off, which means that film list now only has 17 in. So as you can see, we're starting to go down. I haven't shown you how we're going to loop round yet, but this is how we start to work through this list in turn. Now, having got the IMDb URL, it will call it. And if I hit send, you will see, because this film URL is the variable we set, if I do a preview down here, you'll see it's literally retrieved the HTML page of IMDb. Now, there's a great library called Cheerio, which makes it very, very useful to work with HTML responses. We're going to see it very briefly. But you'll see there, of course, the film that's come back is the film called Wing Commander, which I don't know why that got 4 stars, unless it's 4 out of 100, because Wing Commander is not a good film. But if we go across to the tests tab, we'll see what we're verifying on this and also how we link up this last piece. So unsurprisingly, what we do is we look back in our variables and we look at what is the name of the film we expect to find. And we put it into a variable called expected film name. We check that we get a 200 response back. There's that classic 200 response test that we've seen a couple of times before. And this is a very simple example of using Cheerio. Again, Cheerio has its own documentation, but all we're doing is we're saying, we'll get the HTML that came back from the response. We're using a locator, which if you've used something like Selenium, this will be very familiar to you. You can find by a HTML tag or by CSS or by XPath, for example, and just get me the text that's in the H1 tag. And that I can assure you is that tag there, as Wing Commander. And we check that the film that's there is the same as the film that's in our database. Then we get to the magic. And again, the code here is perhaps less scary than it seems. I've over-commented this just to make it very easy for anyone who's coming to it in their own time. But what we do is thus. We look back at that film list again that's in our global variable. If you remember, we're now down to 17 because we took one off. We check if the length is still more than 0, then we tell the runner, set the next request to be this same thing that we've just done. basically we're going to go deja vu, we're going to run through again, except next time when we start, we've only got 17 films to start with. We're going to pop one off, then there'll be 16. And we do this over and over and over again until finally the length is no longer greater than 0. We've finished, at which point there's a special value we can use to say, if we set the next request to null, that tells the runner that we are done. Now, it looks complicated, but it's very few lines of code. And the easiest way to explain or for you to see it is for me to just click run. So you see there's only 2 requests, but rather than just running 2 things, it's going to do the second request a load of times. Let's go into view results. You can see, because I put the film name into the test name, you can see that it's going through a different one each time. There we go. Each of these 1999 films, we're loading the IMDb page for each one, which is why it's taking a couple of seconds, and we're checking the film name that comes back.
Yeah, so the last time you ran it, you actually ran different iterations, but in this case, you only have 2 requests. You're iterating on that second request.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the beauties of iterations is, yeah, you can have an iteration at the top level, and also you can have iterations within iterations as well, should you want to.
Yeah. So to answer Hitesh's question, Neil is using variables to save the state of the big bunch of grapes, and then popping off a grape, and then checking that grape. Popping off a grape, checking that grape. I love that analogy.
Yeah, it's a really good one to walk through in your own time, because it's not a lot of lines of code. It's doing things that are, if they're complex or new to you, it's worth walking through in your own time, maybe using a console.log statement to understand what data is where at various points. We're a bit short of time, but there is an example here that you can run. There's a data example here of actually, you could just have, for example, a CSV file that you load to generate your test data. So you can use the runner to execute multiple. You see, I've only got one request in here called get movie, but I'm going to iterate it over it a number of times for each line of this CSV. And this is really useful because, again, it helps to pull your test data out of the tests. And this allows you to have conversations within the business of actually someone like a business analyst who isn't necessarily familiar with JavaScript at all. No disrespect to business analysts, but you could pass this text file here to somebody and explain, well, these are the test scenarios we're using. If you imagine if this was something like a login scenario where you've got like, you want to test with like 20, 30 different combinations of what a valid password might be, you can actually say, well, here, written in text are my scenarios. Would you like to contribute? Can you suggest anything more that we should have? Is there anything here unnecessary or duplicated? So putting the data out of the test is actually really useful for sharing that information within the business.
Yeah, so previously you showed us Faker. Faker generates random data and it's coming from Faker.js. But if you have your own test cases, this is how you can hit hundreds, thousands of scenarios, but with your own test data.
Yeah. So that's basically that's the runner in a nutshell. Is it can run multiple tests in various combinations. It can do it in complex ways, so you can shift the order of execution around. Very quickly before we get to Q&A, I want to touch on how you use this for automation. So basically, you can take what's in runner and you can pump it into either a Postman monitor or into Newman. So I'll show you a monitor first of all. There's documentation here. There's no request within it because, as the documentation will explain, we're going to reuse the one we've already done. So I'm going to take the simple linear sequence and I'm going to put it into its own collection. I'm going to call this my monitor test. And just for ease, I'm going to take the simple linear sequence and I'm just going to drag it out of place and into my monitor test. The reason I'm doing this is because when you use a monitor in Postman, it will run against every request in the entire collection. Now, the collection, of course, that we've got here has loads of different chapters, lots of which we don't care about right now. I just want to test this. Now, Postman's monitors, what they do is they are a scheduled process that can run, for example, every X hours or once a day or however much you choose to configure it. And it will run these tests that you've just seen in the runner in the cloud in their own time, and they will alert if any of your tests are failing. The easiest way to do that is, again, by just showing you. I'm going to need to just create a variable quickly because these are all using a variable called base URL. And that URL, that variable doesn't yet exist in this project. So I'm just going to create it at the collection level. And I know the URL is unbreakableapi.com. Just hit save there, so this will work. That caught me out when I was practicing. Again, there are many ways you can add a monitor. You could go to the monitors tab, or within here, you could just say, you click the drop-down menu against the collection name and say, I want to monitor this collection. And it's a very simple form to walk through. You give the monitor a name, Neil's monitor. There are various metadata here. If you're using, for example, environments, I'm going to say that I want to run this every day. At the end of the day, let's say I want to run it at 11 p.m. just to make sure no one's broken anything during the day. I could say where I want my email notifications to go. If there are failures, where should it tell me? Should it automatically retry? And so on and so forth. And that's basically all you need to do. Once I've clicked created, it will say this monitor hasn't yet been run. I'm going to run it now just so you can see what the interface looks like. And it will sit there and it has gone green. And I'm going to run it again. And what you see is not only did it go green, it ran marginally faster this time as well. So there's some degrees of performance check in there as well. So you can see how your performance behaves over time. So you can see whether your requests are getting slower. As you scroll down here, you can see, again, the familiar view that you would have seen there in the runner, the same sort of data. There are the results of all your tests. You can choose to drill down. You can look at the request and response data. And that means that over time, this is effectively allowing you to create an entire automation solution within Postman itself. So you can have Postman can trigger this either on a timer, like the one I just set up. There's also the ability, if you look in the documentation, to use things like webhooks, so you can get other processes to trigger it. You could write a Slack command to trigger off your tests. This is something that we do all the time internally within Postman. So if you've not seen the runner before, it's a way of taking if you've not seen the monitor before, it's a way of taking the runner data and running it regularly on a schedule to perform, for example, regression testing, to just make sure that everything's still okay.
Yeah, so you use the runner while you're maybe developing your test in Postman, and then the monitors are running from Postman servers. You scheduled one, and then you also manually ran it on Postman servers. And you mentioned webhooks, which is really exciting. Webhooks are monitors under the hood.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, and there's so much you can do to filter down. You can look at the performance of individual requests, for example, to see which requests are the ones that are being slow. It's a whole different separate topic for a whole different conversation, really. I also, just from there, I want to very quickly touch upon Newman just before we get to Q&A. So Newman is Postman's command line runner, which again takes the same data that you've just seen in the runner, that you've just seen in the monitor, and it allows you to trigger it through the command line. And now, obviously, the main benefit of that is if you want to plug it into a continuous integration process. If your team is using something like Travis or Jenkins or Team City, you can make it so that when your build completes, it also automatically does the things that I just demonstrated there. You can have it check whether the API is still behaving in the way that it was before. And I'm just going to run a very, very simple test of this. Now, we've covered this in more detail in separate webinars where we had more time. So I do advise, if you look at our previous continuous testing webinar, and there's a really good walkthrough of actually plugging it directly into Jenkins from start to finish. I'm just going to show you it literally in the command line for now, for time. The first thing we need to do is get the data out of Postman so that we can use it in our process. And now, again, in order to do that, we just go into our project. I'm going to take the data from monitor test, and I'm going to say that I want to export it. I'm going to export it in the recommended format, the latest one, and it automatically saves it as collection name _ Postman collection. If I now just quickly go across to my command line, if I get my correct screenshot and just bring up my command line, move this window out of the way so I can see it. Now, I've already pre-installed Newman, and there are instructions again in our documentation about how you install Newman. It is installed in scope here, and all you need to do is type Newman run, and then the name of the file that you want. So that is the file that I just exported. And I'm going to say I want to run it again. For the sake of argument, I'm going to run it 5 times. And if I hit enter, you'll see a command line interface, which again is representing the same data that you saw in the monitor, the same data that you saw in the runner. It's doing all the same things. It's executing the same things, but it's doing it from the command line in a way that you can plug it into some other system. And it will also return back a report at the end, which again, everything is green, everything is happy. You can also, as a small bonus, he says, try to find his autocomplete. Is that correct? There we go. We have what we call reporters that you can plug into Newman. I just want to advertise this one in particular, written by Postman author Danny Dainton, is a way of taking this data, and rather than exporting it as a little ASCII grid there, it will give you a nice report. If I go into my folder where this lives, it is this one. And here is a glowing report that you didn't have to do any work to create. It's created for you. There's so much rich data in here. You could drill down like you did in Postman and look at what's gone on in individual responses, in individual iterations. You can see all of the metadata, and that's just there for free. You saw I just added one extra tag to the end of Newman's command line, And suddenly I've got a report that I can surface and put into my build artifacts, and it can live alongside the builds, and it can help us to trace back build after build exactly where something went wrong, exactly how something was performing before. And again, this is to wrap up everything I've been saying. This is a really neat way of taking what effectively is testing, which is the act of running some tests, and turning it into quality information that you can give to the business and say, here is information that you can act upon. Here is stuff that we can discuss. Why is this build slower than the previous one? Why has this build got 5 times more failures? So yeah, that in a nutshell is how you run tests, and you do it in an automated fashion.
Yeah, so Newman is a node package. It's open source too. So Neil, you showed how to run it from command line. I dropped a link to a recording of how to do it with Jenkins. It's literally doing the same thing, installing Newman in your CI environment and then running it whenever you kick off your pipeline build. And then you can also use it in scripts. You can require Newman and then run it in custom scripts. So it's open source, a lot of love in the community. Danny Dainton's HTML extra is gangbusters. Look at how beautiful that is. You could send that to where we're picking on business analysts earlier. You can send it to a business analyst, and even they could view these results in their browser.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I mean, we want to get to Q&A. I want to save a little bit of time for Q&A for a few minutes at the end. So we're not going to get time to go to snapshot testing.
Actually,
as I said at the
Neil, we've been answering questions from Q&A. I don't know if you realize this, but we've been answering questions throughout. So I would say, let's just take a few minutes and go over snapshot testing.
Okay. So this is taking advantage of Postman's mock servers in an interesting way. So if, as a tester, if you've heard of the phrase snapshot testing, you might be more familiar with it for UI testing, or the concept of what we now call visual regression testing, where you take a literal screenshot of an application, and the next time you run a build, you compare a screenshot of how it looks now to how it looks before, and you look for whether there are any pixel differences to indicate whether anything is different. Now, snapshot testing, when you're working with API data, is much more straightforward because you're dealing with raw data. You don't have to worry about things like screen resolutions or things like that. They are much more stable, if anything. And there's a way you can do it natively within Postman, and there is a collection that was built internally here. If you click on the snapshot testing with mock servers, there is another run in Postman button, because this calls out to another project that already exists. I will clone this project into my workspace in much the same way as I did at the start. And then I'll explain what mock servers are and how they can help us with snapshot testing. I'll keep the default name for time's sake, just make sure we have one. And we've got a project here called Snapshot Testing using Postman. And again, it has its own documentation here. So if I'm going through this too fast, you can walk through it in your own time. I assure you it's very straightforward to do. Now, in Postman, we have the concept of a mock server, and a mock server is usually part of the API development process, and it's used by teams while their endpoints are still under construction. And it's to allow, for example, your front-end team to start coding against responses that don't exist yet. So you can actually just create a sample and say, well, this is what the data is going to look like. We haven't built the backend yet or the database to support it, but if you hit this endpoint, this is the data that you will get back. So it's a way of creating fake but realistic data. And it's supported in Postman through the use of what we call examples. So you saw many requests earlier. So here's an example of a request called snapshot test demo. If I expand one layer down further in this demo, there is an item called snapshot test demo snapshot. Now, this is an example. Examples in Postman are more commonly used for documentation. When you generate documentation, it will also embed these examples. But what we're doing here is we're combining mock servers and examples to help us generate a snapshot test. What we have is an example of the Postman echo site again. If you ask it to return a given status, it will return that status. It echoes back that status to you. If I send this request here now, you will see, ignore the test failures for now because I've not done the thing I need to do, but you will see it comes back with status is 200. That's what happens when you hit the endpoint itself. But how do we know that that response is the correct one? Well, maybe we've taken a snapshot of how it looked before, which in this case we have. If we click on this example, you'll see down here, we expect the data to come back is status 200. Now, to do a snapshot test, if we follow the instructions here, we have done steps 1 and 2 already. In fact, 3 has been done for us as well. We've already saved the example response. That's that one that's in the left column there. All we need to do now is just create a mock server, which we do through the sidebar. Again, they are extremely easy to create. We just say, I want to create a mock server against an existing collection, and it's that one called snapshot test. I'm going to call it demo mock server. There are various other configuration options that we don't need to worry about right now. I'll hit create, and now I have a mock server, and it has a URL. You see it has like a guid.mock.postman. That's how you know that it's a mock. For the purposes of getting this working, I'm going to copy that mock to the clipboard. Then I'm going to check my instructions, which tell me I need to update the snapshot URL in the collection variables. So I will do that, hide this documentation out of the way. We're in the collection. Let's look at the variables. It wants to know, where does the snapshot live? And the answer is here. I'll just save that. And now we've got an error the first time we ran this because I wasn't set up to run my tests. But if I run this again now, we've got some green tests. Now, what tests are running and where are they running? We definitely don't have time to cover it right now. I will summarize it as saying what it's done is it's looked at the actual response that's come back. It's compared it against that snapshot and it's seen if they're the same. But it's, the example in the test here is a lot more complicated than that, as you will see from the several hundred lines of script. Basically, this can be configured in several different ways. You'll see there are 3 strategies at the bottom of this test, and I advise you to walk through them in your own time. But basically, you can either check that it's an entire like-for-like copy, so you can check that it actually has generally come back with status 200, or you can do something, what I really like is you can actually say, this is just a representative. This is like a schema definition, like we did in my very first test. And we basically say we want something like that, which means we want an attribute called status, and then we want something that's a number. So we can make it so that even if it came back with status something else, we consider that to be a pass. Again, it's a bigger topic for a bigger day, but it's a really useful way of keeping your test examples deep within your Postman project and harnessing mock servers to generate them in an interesting way.
I think that was really valuable. We don't talk about mocks that often in our space camps. So seeing how you can use mocks for testing, I think is very valuable. And I know that happened very fast. So let me just recap. Neil, I love a fast talker, but you've also done a really great job with the documentation. So I'm very pleased that people can go back, and if something went a little fast, you can always just poke at it, the examples yourself. Really rich demonstrations. So we talked about continuous quality. It's a mindset, and it's a mindset that can help catch defects earlier, that everyone in your organization should be practicing no matter what their function. We talked about the external libraries, and we did have a question from Danush in the Q&A asking, where can you find the libraries that are supported? So I believe Arlemy has dropped a link to the Postman documentation. There's a lot of inbuilt libraries. And Neil, I don't know if you explicitly called it out, but the Postman engineers have done a lot of good work to autocomplete. So when you're in the pre-request or test tabs, there's a lot of auto completion. If you're not really familiar with the Postman sandbox, a lot of methods, a lot of functions at your fingertips just by typing slowly and seeing what pops up. And then you showed the Postman runner to run tests locally. You showed the iterations. You talked about how you can loop through test files. You showed monitors. You can schedule it to run on Postman servers. And you also kind of sneak peeked at the webhooks, which are monitors behind the hood. And then you showed Newman running from your command line, but that's how you can integrate with your CI pipeline if you have one. And then I'm so glad we had a chance to take a sneak peek at snapshot testing using mock servers. So Postman is an actively developed API platform. By the time you come across this video or rewatch it, stuff might have changed. So a couple things that you can take a look forward to. Coming up very soon, we announced this at Galaxy, but Flow Runner, if you're a little bit intimidated by like writing JavaScript or just want a more visual way to get started, Flow Runner is going to be a low code, no code way to map out some of those more sophisticated workflows. Postman announced support for WebSockets. And so building out more support for WebSockets and other protocols is coming soon. And if you are not working alone, if you're working on a team, version control, I believe in Q&A, we had a question from MD Moeen asking about what's the recommended way to keep a Postman collection in version control system like Git. There's a lot of inbuilt functionality to push to GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever you're using for source control, and then also versioning. What week is it? Last week, we launched V9 of Postman. So a lot of new stuff coming with version control, source control, and I will mention application performance integration monitoring. What's the I? APIM integrations. So a lot of new stuff coming. If you're working with the team, a lot of stuff coming. There is a link to our public roadmap right there. Check it out. and additional resources. You have been playing around in the Postman Space Camp. Neil made the most amazing collection called Continuous Quality with Postman with lots of rich examples. That's my favorite way to learn. I take an example and then poke at it, and then that's how I learned. We also have 30 days of Postman for developers. So if you're an SDET or you're more on the development side, that is a good resource. 30 days of Postman for testers is coming. So it'll be a subset focused specifically on testing. Community forum is a great place to ask specific questions from the Postman community. And then one more shout out is Test Examples in Postman is a workspace that contains, I believe it contains snapshot testing. It has negative testing with Unbreakable. I'll drop Neil's collection there too. It's a really good resource for you to just take a look at other examples. All right, so we did do Q&A already. We've answered them throughout. So if you have any other questions, there's still a few minutes. Go ahead and ask your questions. One last piece I ask you to do, I'll go ahead and drop a link to this survey in the chat, or if somebody, Arlemy or Sean, can drop a link to this survey. We actually take your feedback very, very seriously. So if there is some topic that you want to go more in depth into, go ahead and let us know. We're a small team. So Neil, you've been so excited about preparing content for this session. If you hear that people are like, we want more mock servers or tell us about the webhooks, we will create a session for you. So you were kind enough to show up live. Go ahead and provide your feedback. The link should be in the chat, hopefully. Neil, do you feel good? Is there any final last words of wisdom about continuous quality? I think something, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the real takeaway is if you can get these tests embedded in your collections. You mentioned in the Q&A that we're really keen on sharing our API collections around. Those tests, that test tab is just there. If you can get tests embedded in there that are, for example, schema tests or things that just check the integrity of your collection, those are going to be run every time by people without even realizing they're doing it. So there is real value in just having data in there. You're collecting information for free, and that can really help to detect problems earlier. Also, just a big shout out again for the community forum in particular. If you have very specific problems, or if I've gone through that very, very quickly, then the community forum is a good way to get particular examples worked through, debugged. It's a really great place full of really useful people.
And I have a shout out for if there's any testers here or security minded people, I have a stream coming up tomorrow at the same time as this session was. It's going to be on white hat penetration testing. So if you're responsible for pen testing, we're going to try our hardest to break some stuff. We'll go through the OWASP API vulnerabilities, and it'll be another hands-on type of thing. And then we also have next month's Space Camps scheduled. They should be up on the Space Camp website. We have a two-parter for API publishers. If you have a public API, invite your developer relations folks like me, invite your tech writers, invite your PMs. This is how you can really document in a more rich fashion and then gain adoption for your public API. And Neil, did you have any shout outs that you wanted to give?
A huge shout out to everyone in the Postman community, particularly the Postman Supernovas, who are putting so much good information out there. Valentine Desper's videos, he has a YouTube channel, just constantly amaze me. Like he's doing all the things that I wish I had time to do, basically. So his content is really, really useful for helping you to get up to speed with what Postman does. Also, a big shout out to a friend of mine called Beth Marshall, who's recently made a course on Test Automation University, which is an introduction to Postman. It's free for you to go look at. Test Automation University is a great resource for automation across all products, but it's a really good Postman material on there.
Okay, and with that, let me go to the last slide, which is just thank you. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Neil, thank you so much for preparing these resources and guiding us through it. I think you've really taken it up a level, and thank you so much for stopping by.
It's a pleasure. I'm more than welcome for anyone whose questions I haven't had time to answer. Please feel free to reach out to me, especially through the forum. Send me a DM on there. You can find me. I think my username is @NeilStud, probably, or Neil.Stud. But you can find me, and I'll be happy to talk to you.
Yeah. Okay. Until next time. See you tomorrow or next week. Goodbye.
Bye.